Let's go now to our political editor, Jane Patterson, who's joining us live from Parliament. Jane, the Prime Minister has acknowledged that these are extraordinary times and this is an extraordinary decision.
This is a huge move on behalf of the New Zealand government, and we heard there when Ms Ardern was being questioned that Australia has just moved to put in very similar controls on their border. When you look around the world, there are really varying states of border controls. Canada, of course, shutting down its borders, but this really does put New Zealand right up there in terms of putting that fence around the country to stop any international travellers coming in from basically midnight tonight. And as you heard the Prime Minister being questioned, we've heard reports this week of international travellers arriving, being required to self-isolate, but not always seeming willing or keen to do that. So I'm sure that was a factor in their decision as well. Can we afford to keep letting people in? And we don't know that they're going to self-isolate for that required 14 days.
She has mentioned the fact that, well, this is going to have an impact on our economy, but what, health is more important at this point?
That's right, and I think what you will have seen since that announcement on Saturday, that actually the number of international travellers would have really started to die down or trickle down. Now, this will obviously put a full stop on those numbers. It'll be interesting to know the difference between the mix of New Zealanders who obviously will be trying to get home from all around the world and actually how many international travellers are continuing to come in. There are humanitarian exemptions, but I would say that would be an incredibly high threshold. Also, dependents and children of New Zealand citizens and permanent residents will also be allowed in the border, be allowed across the border. Also, I think very noteworthy in this announcement is that Pacific Island people will now be included effectively in the border control. If you remember in the initial announcement, people from the Pacific were basically given an exemption, a recognition of the close relationship and the any protection New Zealand could offer, but that door has been closed. The people from the Pacific will be treated as anyone else under this new border shutdown.
The Prime Minister also mentioned the fact that she had been uncomfortable with reports about what was going on at airports with people landing. Says she sent a minister out there to check it out.
That's right. So Morning Report this morning, we heard a woman who was shocked at what was happening at the airport when she arrived. She talked about really no consistent advice being given, that people seemed confused, that if people didn't have good English, some appeared not to really know what was going on or understand the requirements. Now, this came up in Parliament this afternoon. The Customs Minister, Jenny Salisa, said she went out to the airport this morning to see what was going on, and there were, quote, some areas for improvement. That was reiterated by the Health Minister, David Clark. Now, I imagine this would have caused alarm because that is the protection point. That is the point at which anyone arriving into New Zealand is supposed to be questioned very closely about their symptoms or travel history, very specifically given self-isolation guidelines and expected to follow it. Now, if that whole process, if there were holes in that process, that would have caused ministers a great deal of concern. Again, I'm sure that all of that would have fed into this decision this afternoon.
Thanks for joining us. That's our political editor, Jane Patterson. And also in the studio with me now is our health correspondent, Rowan Quinn. Rowan, how does this closure of the border fit into what we've seen with the cases that are arriving in New Zealand?
Well, we know that all 28 now, so it's a number that's actually escalated quite a lot in the last couple of days, they're all overseas related. So we've had at least one that was transmitted in New Zealand, but it was between family members of someone who had been overseas. So what the Prime Minister is saying is that this is all part of their plan to protect New Zealanders, and that so far it seems that the cases are coming from overseas. And so by closing that border down even further, the plan is, I guess, to keep it out. And she's saying there that it's perhaps easier to track New Zealanders, that she said she's going to beef up the questions that they're asked when they arrive at the border. She said, as Jane mentioned, that she was unhappy with some of the behaviour of overseas tourists, and she's saying that they were, I think, flouting expectations were the words that she used. And whereas she feels that New Zealanders, by and large, were actually complying with the expectations to self-isolate for 2 weeks once they got here.
Yeah, so she said it was an unacceptable risk that she felt she needed to put an end to, and she is wanting again, her words, more intensive conversations and questions at the border.
That's right, and we know anecdotally that people have been saying that they felt they were kind of coming back into the country and not seeing a lot of questioning, that there was a sign here and there or a very casual conversation. And as Jane said, her minister's also saying the same thing now. So. But I think also the other thing is that same language that they've been using for a few days now, the government, of slowing this virus down, of stopping the risk and protecting New Zealanders is the language that they're using. And there's been a bit of a shift in I guess how they see it playing out. Initially there was a lot of talk at the start of the week of flatten the curve so that we didn't have a huge surge.
Prime Minister even had a graph of
She
the curve.
did of the curve, yeah. And now that's changed to perhaps they're saying multiple peaks of the disease. So I guess it's lots of little curves is the way, and that's come from some overseas evidence that suggested that might be the best way that a health system like ours can manage this disease.
Also, we have had today one of the supermarkets coming out and limiting the amount of product that people can buy, loo paper, hand sanitizer and all the rest of it. She, again, was sending a strong message there about have a plan, be prepared, but basically don't panic.
That's right, and she's saying that these restrictions, the new very tough restrictions that have come in, apply to people, not products. So anything that New Zealanders need from overseas will still be coming in, she says. Although, as you've covered on Checkpoint, we know that some things actually do come in by flight. So
passenger, 65% of pharmaceuticals, medicines come in by passenger plane.
Exactly, and they're obviously very important. So if there are fewer planes coming in with fewer tourists coming on board, then you have to wonder how that will impact upon that supply. But as far as shops are concerned, she's saying the shelves will be stocked. The Prime Minister's saying be prepared by all means, but don't panic, don't hoard, don't overstock.
Okay, so there was a good bit of news today, which was the tests of the 150 tests that were being done at the Dunedin school.
Yeah, 150 of them all negative. So that's great news for the community down there in Dunedin because, of course, that's a lot of people and then their contacts are a lot of people. I guess it's good news that as well that perhaps the suggestion that the child, there was a child there whose father had contracted COVID-19. He obviously wasn't able to pass that on to his fellow pupils and a lot of contacts, which you would expect in a school. But they are still being self-isolated, so there is still some care being taken about those 150. Even though they've all come back negative, they'll have to self-isolate for 2 weeks.
Thanks, Rowan. That's Rowan Quinn, our health correspondent. And just to reiterate there, from 11:59 this evening, the borders to New Zealand will be closed to all non-citizens and people who are not permanent residents. So travellers, foreigners will not be allowed into the country from 11:59 tonight. Those planes already in the air will be allowed to land, and those people will be met and warned at the airport about the requirements around self-isolation. Prime Minister saying that she was not prepared to continue on with an unacceptable risk and that the health of New Zealanders comes first.